Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Easy English Spark channel. I'm so glad you're here today. I hope you're ready to ignite your English listening and speaking skills and take your fluency to the next level. Today, we're diving into an exciting journey where we'll walk through key moments of a survival story. Just like how you can overcome challenges in English. Together, we'll explore ways to boost your confidence and speak more naturally. So, let's get started and light up your English path, your new home for speaking skills. Chapter 1. The Cold Journey. It was an unusually cold day, even for the remote wilderness Samuel found himself in. As he trudged along the narrow trail, his boots crunched heavily against the deep snow. The sky above was a dull gray, casting an overcast glow that seemed to stretch endlessly across the frozen landscape. It was as if the world itself had been swallowed by winter, leaving only the cold and the quiet behind. The biting wind whipped through the air, stinging Samuel's face, as he pulled his jacket tighter around him. He had never experienced a winter like this before. The wind felt sharper, harsher, like it was trying to tear through his very bones. Despite wearing his thickest jacket, layered clothing, and sturdy fur-lined boots, the cold seemed to seep into his skin. His fingers were stiff, and his nose was already beginning to numb. Yet, he kept walking, step by painful step, his breath coming out in thick clouds that disappeared into the frigid air. Samuel had grown up in warmer climates and never imagined that he would one day find himself in the Alaskan wilderness, facing such extreme conditions. This was his first winter here, and it was testing him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The snow that surrounded him was pure and untouched, stretching as far as the eye could see. It was both beautiful and intimidating. The white expanse seemed endless, and with every mile he walked, Samuel couldn't help but feel smaller and more insignificant against the vastness of nature. He had been traveling for hours now, his destination, Winterbrook Creek, a small cabin where his friends had been waiting for him. It was a long journey, and Samuel had set out with the hope of arriving by evening. He knew that by the time he reached the cabin, it would be dark. He could already feel the sun slipping lower in the sky, the promise of warmth and food from his friends keeping him going. The silence around him was profound. There was no sound, other than the occasional gust of wind and the steady crunch of his boots in the snow. It was the kind of silence that made you feel utterly alone, even though you knew you weren't. Samuel looked back every now and then, half expecting to see the figure of the dog trailing behind him, but it wasn't there. He had left the animal behind hours ago, knowing that it wasn't accustomed to such cold. It was a big animal, part wolf, part dog, and had the build to survive in the wild, but even it struggled with the bitter cold. As Samuel continued on his path, he could feel his body growing weary. His muscles ached, and his skin burned with the cold. The thought of stopping and resting crossed his mind, but he pushed it away. He knew that if he rested too long, he would lose the momentum needed to reach Winterbrook Creek before nightfall. There was a sense of urgency now. He couldn't afford to stop. Not until he was safe, with the warmth of the fire and the company of his friends. Each step Samuel took felt heavier than the last. His mind started to wander as his body battled against the fatigue, focusing on little things to distract himself from the discomfort. He thought of his friends waiting for him, of the fire that would warm him from the inside out, and the hot food he would devour as soon as he arrived. But even those thoughts couldn't shield him from the cold that clung to him like a second skin. It was relentless, unyielding. Samuel could feel it in the tips of his ears, in the chill creeping through his gloves and into his bones. He glanced up at the sky once again, and his heart sank. There was no sign of the sun breaking through the clouds. The day was fading quickly, and Samuel was still far from his destination. His legs were stiff, his movements slower now. He couldn't afford to slow down, but his body seemed to be betraying him, urging him to stop, to rest, to give in to the cold. He ignored it, though. There was no turning back. His friends were waiting, and he couldn't fail them now. Chapter 2. The Ice and Snow. As Samuel pushed forward, the cold seemed to grow more intense, biting into his skin and sapping his strength. The snow underfoot crunched with every step, but it felt like walking on a layer of frozen glass, brittle and unforgiving. The wind howled through the trees, its voice high-pitched and angry, swirling around Samuel's head and making him squint against the freezing gusts. He pulled his collar up higher, trying to shield his face from the sharp sting of the cold air. The world around him was a silent, frozen wasteland. A heavy blanket of white stretched across the land, covering everything in sight. The trees, stripped of their leaves, stood like dark skeletons against the vast whiteness. The snowflakes that drifted down from the gray sky seemed endless, soft, constant falling that added to the stillness, muffling all sound. It was as if the world had been silenced by the snow, leaving only Samuel and the endless expanse of winter to contend with. Samuel could feel the temperature dropping even further, each breath leaving a small cloud of vapor in the air before disappearing into the distance. His throat felt tight, the cold air too dry to comfort him, and his lungs burned with each inhalation. The wind picked up again, sending flurries of snow into his face. He blinked hard, trying to clear the snowflakes from his eyes. It was as if the very landscape itself was trying to prevent him from reaching his destination. He had been walking for what seemed like hours, but time felt irrelevant in this harsh, frozen world. The path ahead of him was faint, barely visible beneath the thick snow. But Samuel kept his eyes focused ahead, each step a small victory against the overwhelming weight of the cold. He knew that he needed to keep moving, or else the cold would consume him, body and soul. The snow was deeper now, reaching up to his knees in some places. Samuel had to lift his legs higher with each step, struggling to maintain any momentum. He was getting tired, his legs growing heavier with each step, the cold eating away at his resolve. His boots, once sturdy and reliable, now felt like lead, sinking deeper into the snow with every movement. It was getting harder to lift them. The wind was relentless, biting at his face and freezing the sweat that had begun to form on his brow. Samuel's thoughts began to turn inward, trying to recall the warmth of his friends waiting for him at Winterbrook Creek. That thought, that vision of safety, was the only thing keeping him going now. He could almost imagine the crackling fire, the scent of hot food filling the air, the sound of his friends laughing as they greeted him. He focused on that. The warmth that would soon be his if he could just make it through the snow and ice. But as the wind howled louder and the snow continued to fall, that vision felt more and more distant. The trail ahead of him started to narrow, the snow deepening even further. Samuel knew he had to be careful here. The ice beneath the snow was unpredictable, and he couldn't afford to make any missteps. The wind was blowing so fiercely now that it was hard to see where the path ended and the open wilderness began. The snowflakes seemed to swirl in the air like tiny daggers, biting into his skin with an intensity that made him want to stop and find shelter. But there was no shelter. Not out here. Ahead, he could see the dark outline of a ridge, and beyond that, the faint silhouette of trees. He couldn't be far from Winterbrook Creek now, but it felt like the distance between them was growing longer with every step he took. Samuel's breath came faster now, his chest aching with each inhalation. His heart pounded in his ears, but he knew he couldn't stop. He had to keep moving no matter how difficult it was, no matter how much the cold seemed to push against him. Suddenly, something caught his eye in the distance. The snow ahead seemed to shift, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something darker against the white expanse. His eyes squinted, trying to focus, but the snow was coming down so thickly that he could barely make out what it was. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, chalking it up to the disorienting effects of the storm. But then he realized that it was a break in the landscape, a subtle difference in the snow, almost as if the path ahead had opened up into something else. It was a frozen stream, one that Samuel had heard about from the locals, though he hadn't expected to encounter it here. He stopped, cautiously eyeing the snow-covered ice. It looked solid enough, but the thin layer of snow that covered it made it impossible to tell just how thick or safe it was. Samuel stepped closer, the weight of his boots shifting the snow beneath him, and he knelt to examine the ice more closely. The crackling sound of the wind was the only noise that broke the silence as he tested the surface with the tip of his boot. It held. Just. But Samuel knew better than to trust appearances. The ice was treacherous, and one wrong step could spell disaster. He stood up, glancing along the stream, considering his options. The current ran beneath the ice, and he could see slight cracks, tiny fractures in the surface. The ice was thin here, and one slip could break through, sending him into the freezing water below. Samuel took a deep breath, the weight of the cold pressing against him. He carefully made his way along the bank of the stream, staying well away from the thin sections of ice. Each step was deliberate, calculated. He couldn't afford to rush. The stream was a dangerous obstacle, one that could cost him everything if he wasn't cautious. But for now, the ice held, and Samuel was still. On solid ground, he pressed on, the weight of the snow beneath his boots, and the relentless wind at his back, pushing him forward. With each step, the wind howled louder, and the snow kept falling, never ceasing. The world around him was a blur of white, the icy landscape stretching endlessly in every direction. Samuel couldn't help but feel as if he were walking in a dream, isolated, alone, and yet determined to keep going. The cold might have been fierce, the snow might have been unrelenting, but Samuel was determined. He would reach Winterbrook Creek. He would survive. The fire, his friends, and the warmth of safety were within his reach. He just had to keep walking. Chapter 3. The Lone Traveler. Samuel had always considered himself a man who could handle solitude. He had spent years traveling through various parts of the world, often venturing alone, relying on his own wits and strength to navigate whatever challenges came his way. But this journey, this brutal test of survival, felt different. With every step, the reality of the wilderness around him pressed in on him more heavily. He was alone in the vast expanse of Alaska's untamed wilderness, the snow and ice stretching endlessly in every direction. The wind howled through the trees, the only sound accompanying his footsteps as they crunched through the thick snow. And even though the air was still and quiet in some ways, it felt as if the wilderness itself was alive, alive with danger, with silent threats, and an unyielding force that seemed determined to test his limits. Samuel had heard the warnings. The locals had spoken of the dangers of traveling alone in such a harsh environment. The old-timers in town had given him stern looks, shaking their heads as they told him that no one, no matter how tough or experienced, should venture into the Alaskan wild alone, especially not in the middle of winter. But Samuel had dismissed their advice. He had always believed that if a man was smart, if he paid attention to the signs of nature, he could survive anything. He had been wrong, of course, but it wasn't until now, when the cold gnawed at his bones and the ice beneath his feet seemed to threaten his every move, that he understood the gravity of their words. As he walked, he thought of the others, his companions waiting for him at Winterbrook Creek. He could almost see them now, gathered around a fire, warming themselves, laughing and sharing stories. They had made it to the cabin days ago, settling in before the worst of the winter weather had arrived. Samuel had been delayed, caught up with other tasks that had kept him away longer than planned. He had hoped to catch up, to make it to the cabin before nightfall. But now, the idea of reaching his destination before the darkness swallowed him seemed impossible. He had been walking for hours, the snow growing deeper with each step. His legs were aching from the exertion, and his body felt heavy from the constant battle with the cold. The air was so frigid now that it burned his lungs with every breath. Samuel could feel the chill creeping into his very soul, and though he was used to physical discomfort, this was something different, something deeper, more insidious. The cold wasn't just affecting his body, it was starting to seep into his mind, slowly eroding his focus, his sense of purpose. And yet, despite all of it, Samuel kept moving. He had no choice. There was no shelter in sight, no safe place to rest. The idea of stopping and waiting out the storm was laughable. It wasn't like he could just sit in the snow and hope for a miracle. He had to keep going, no matter how difficult it became, no matter how much his body protested. As he trudged forward, his thoughts drifted again to the others. He remembered their faces, their voices, warm and familiar. But he couldn't help but feel the nagging sense of doubt creeping in. Had they really made it to the cabin? Would they even be able to help him if he did make it? He had been so sure of himself when he left, confident that he could manage the journey on his own. But now, with the wind howling, the snow falling in thick, swirling sheets, and the ever-present chill gnawing at him, he began to question his decisions. For the first time since setting out on this journey, Samuel felt the weight of his isolation. It wasn't just the physical distance from the cabin, it was the emotional distance, too. He had always prided himself on being a lone traveler, someone who didn't need anyone else to succeed. But now, as he moved further into the frozen wilderness, he realized how fragile that belief was. The vast, empty expanse of snow around him felt endless, and for the first time, the silence seemed deafening. It wasn't just the lack of company that bothered him. It was the lack of control. The cold was something he couldn't fight, something he couldn't ignore. It had a life of its own, pushing him, testing him with every breath he took. Samuel had learned early on in his travels that control was an illusion. No matter how prepared you were, no matter how strong or clever you were, nature always had the upper hand. It could turn against you in an instant, as it had today. Despite his growing sense of doubt, Samuel didn't stop. The thought of failure was unbearable. He couldn't let the wilderness win. He couldn't let the cold or the isolation defeat him. He had to press on, even if it felt like every step was pulling him deeper into the unknown. As he trudged through the snow, Samuel tried to focus on the little things, anything that would take his mind off the mounting exhaustion. He noticed the way the snow settled on the branches of the trees, how the ice clung to the tips of the needles, glittering in the pale light. He focused on the rhythm of his steps, the steady crunch of his boots in the snow, the soft sound of his breath as it came in sharp, visible clouds in front of him. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him going. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. Time was irrelevant in this landscape, where every moment seemed to blend into the next. The snow continued to fall, and the wind continued to howl. But Samuel kept moving, one foot in front of the other, as the thought of Winterbrook Creek and the warmth of his friends kept him pushing forward. But as the day wore on, Samuel felt the isolation growing stronger. It was no longer just about the physical distance between him and his destination. It was the realization that, out here in the wilderness, he was completely and utterly alone. He couldn't rely on anyone else. There was no one to call for help, no one to share the burden with. The journey had become a test of his will, and Samuel wasn't sure how much longer he could hold out. Still, he kept moving, determined to reach his goal. Because no matter how much the cold gnawed at him, no matter how much the isolation threatened to break him, Samuel knew that if he stopped, if he gave in, There would be no coming back. He was the lone traveler. And in this wilderness, it was just him against the world. Chapter 4: The Wolf Dog. The wind howled across the barren landscape, swirling snow into thick clouds that blotted out the already gray sky. Samuel's body was numb from the cold, and his steps had slowed, his energy sapped by the relentless journey. The trail he was following seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, narrowing and widening with the undulating terrain. But Samuel kept moving. Yet, in the back of his mind, there was something else. Something he couldn't ignore, no matter how hard he tried. It wasn't just the isolation that had begun to gnaw at him. There was something else out there. A presence that had been with him for longer than he cared to admit. He glanced over his shoulder again. Nothing but snow and silence met his eyes, but that feeling of being watched, of being followed, persisted. For a moment, he wondered if it was just the isolation, the mind playing tricks on him. The wilderness had a way of making a man feel as if he were never truly alone, even when there was no one in sight. But there it was again, that prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the feeling that something was out there, keeping pace with him. It wasn't until he heard the soft crunch of snow behind him that he knew for sure. He turned sharply, his breath clouding in the air, and there, just at the edge of his vision, he saw the figure. A large, shadowy figure emerged from the swirling white landscape, its form distinct even through the heavy snow. At first, Samuel thought it was just the wind or the way the snow had settled, but then the creature came into focus. A wolf dog, its fur thick and matted against the elements, its piercing eyes locked on Samuel's every move. The animal was massive, larger than most dogs Samuel had seen, and its build was powerful, a mixture of sleek, muscular wolf and sturdy dog. The creature's fur was a mix of grays and blacks, its coat thick enough to withstand the harsh cold, but Samuel could see the discomfort in its movements, the way it gingerly shifted its weight in the snow. The wolf dog was clearly struggling against the cold, but it wasn't retreating. It was standing there watching him, its gaze sharp and calculating, as if it knew something that Samuel didn't. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The wolf dog's gaze was not wild or feral. It was too calm for that. It was the gaze of an animal that had learned to survive in the wilderness, an animal that knew the rules of the land, but also understood the price of survival. There was intelligence in those eyes, a knowing, and Samuel couldn't help but feel that the creature was studying him, weighing him with a silent judgment. The cold seemed to deepen as the wolf dog remained still, its breath visible in the frigid air. The only movement its chest rising and falling slowly. Samuel couldn't explain why, but he felt a sense of connection with the animal. The wolf dog, though alone in the snow, was not out of place here. It had lived through the harshest of winters, learned the patterns of the land, and moved with a grace that Samuel could only admire. In some strange way, the creature felt like a reflection of his own struggle, a survivor in this unforgiving world, just like him. For a moment, there was a strange stillness between them, a quiet understanding that passed in the space between their gazes. The wolf dog was no stranger to hardship, but neither was Samuel. The animal had adapted to survive in this world, just as he was learning to do. Despite the freezing temperatures, Samuel felt a strange warmth in the creature's presence. The wolf dog, like him, was no stranger to loneliness. It moved with an almost human-like grace, as if it too had endured the long hours of solitude and the battle against the cold. There was a kinship between them, a shared struggle to survive in a world that was constantly trying to tear them apart. Samuel took a slow step forward, his feet heavy in the deep snow. The wolf dog's eyes never left him, but it didn't move either. It simply stood there, waiting, as if testing his resolve. Samuel wasn't sure if the animal was assessing whether he was a threat or if it was simply curious. But either way, the feeling of being watched was undeniable, and it sent a shiver down his spine. The wolf dog took a few cautious steps forward, its massive paws leaving deep impressions in the snow. Its eyes never wavered from Samuel's face, but its posture remained relaxed, almost too relaxed, as though it had no fear of the man before it. Samuel stopped, watching it with a mix of curiosity and caution. He knew that animals like this were unpredictable, especially in such harsh conditions. The line between curiosity and threat could be razor thin in the wild, but instead of advancing, the wolf dog lowered its head, sniffing the air as though it could smell something that intrigued it. The wind carried a familiar scent to Samuel's nose, and he realized, with a sinking feeling, that the wolf dog was sensing something more than just his presence. The animal had been trailing him for a while now, staying just out of his sight, watching him from the shadows of the snow-covered trees. For a brief moment, Samuel thought about his situation. He was alone. The wolf dog was alone. But perhaps, in some strange way, they weren't as alone as they both thought. They were two survivors, alone in a world that had no mercy, a world that required both cunning and strength to navigate. And yet, in this shared silence, Samuel felt that the wolf dog was not just another wild creature in the wilderness. It was something more, something wise, something that had learned to survive by understanding the world around it in ways that Samuel could only begin to grasp. The wolf dog seemed to have made its decision. It moved a little closer, closing the distance between them. But instead of approaching with hostility, it lowered its head slightly, as if showing a sign of recognition, or maybe respect. Its eyes softened just a fraction, and it turned its gaze toward the horizon, as if to say that it had seen enough, that it had no interest in challenging him. Samuel watched the animal for a few moments longer, understanding that it wasn't there to harm him. It wasn't there to threaten him. The wolf dog was simply a creature of the wild, as much a part of this world as he was. It knew the land, it knew the risks, and in some way, it seemed to acknowledge that Samuel, too, was trying to find his way through the wilderness. With a final look, the wolf dog turned and slowly began to walk away, its large form blending with the snow as it disappeared into the swirling storm. Samuel watched it go, feeling an unexpected sense of connection to the animal, as though for a brief moment they had shared something deeper than words. As the wolf dog faded from view, Samuel felt the weight of his journey once again. But now there was a sense of resolve in him. The creature had reminded him of something vital. Survival wasn't just about strength. It was about understanding the land, respecting it, and knowing when to push forward and when to let go. He wasn't alone out here, not entirely. And with that thought, he continued on his path, the snow falling silently around him, the wind howling in the distance. Chapter 5. Crossing the Frozen River. The day was dragging on, the snow falling in thick sheets as Samuel continued his journey through the wilderness. His body ached with every step, the cold seeping deeper into his bones, but he pressed on. The cabin at Winterbrook Creek was still a long way off, and the cold seemed determined to slow him down, but there was no turning back now. The wind, though slightly calmer, still carried a biting chill that made every breath feel sharp in his lungs. The vast, snow-covered landscape stretched endlessly in front of him, and with each step, Samuel felt more isolated, more distant from everything he had ever known. Yet, despite the exhaustion that weighed on him, there was a drive, a stubborn will to keep moving forward. As he continued along the narrow trail, Samuel saw a break in the horizon, a dark line that cut across the white expanse. His eyes narrowed, and he recognized it almost immediately. A river. The Winterbrook Creek was not far from here, but in order to reach it, he would have to cross this frozen river. The sight of the water below, frozen solid and coated with layers of ice and snow, brought a new wave of tension to his chest. Crossing a river in the middle of winter wasn't the easiest task, especially when the ice was thick enough to conceal dangerous cracks beneath. It was a gamble. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and he could be swallowed by the frigid waters, swept away into the freezing current below. Samuel paused at the edge of the river, standing still for a moment as the wind whispered through the trees. His breath came in ragged clouds, mixing with the swirling snow that whipped through the air. He squinted at the river, assessing it with careful eyes. The ice looked thick here, too thick to break easily, but the thin layer of snow that coated it made it impossible to see the cracks beneath the surface. He needed to be cautious. The river might seem solid, but ice was a tricky thing. It could appear thick in some spots and thin in others, its surface deceptive. There were no signs of recent movement on the ice, no animals crossing, no footprints from other travelers. But Samuel couldn't afford to let the stillness lull him into a false sense of security. He had learned the hard way that nature could be as unpredictable as it was beautiful. Taking a deep breath, Samuel tested the ice with the toe of his boot. The sound was muffled, the snow soft under his feet. No immediate cracks. He shifted his weight slightly, moving carefully across the snow, inching his way closer to the center of the frozen river. Every step was measured, calculated. One wrong move could send him plunging into the icy waters below, and that would be the end of his journey. The ice creaked under his weight, the low sound unsettling in the otherwise quiet wilderness. Samuel stopped, holding his breath, listening for any sign that the ice might give way beneath him. But all was still. He took another step, then another, his feet sinking a little deeper into the snow with each movement. The cold air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed it anymore. The only thing that mattered now was the ice. The only thing that mattered was getting across. He was so close. He could almost feel the warmth of the fire at Winterbrook Creek, smell the food cooking, hear the voices of his friends. It was all so close, but the river stood between him and his destination. The wind howled once again, whipping the snow in all directions. Samuel shielded his eyes, squinting into the storm. He had to keep moving, and quickly. The light was starting to fade, and night would soon fall. With it would come the freezing temperatures of the Arctic night, and there was no way he could afford to be caught out here in the dark. As he pressed forward, Samuel kept his eyes focused on his next step, making sure the ice was solid underfoot before continuing. It was slow work, but it was the only way. His legs were heavy with fatigue, his muscles sore from hours of walking through the snow. Every movement felt labored, every step a challenge. The weight of the cold was starting to take its toll. The river stretched ahead of him, its surface gleaming in the pale light of the cloudy sky. He could see the far side of the river now, just within reach, the snow-covered banks of Winterbrook Creek waiting on the other side. But the distance was still far enough that he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The ice here was deceiving, and Samuel knew it. He stopped once again, crouching low to inspect the ice more carefully. The cracks were subtle, almost invisible, beneath the thin blanket of snow, but Samuel could see the way the surface shimmered in places. There was a part of the river ahead, just a few yards off, that seemed a little less stable. The ice there was thinner, the cracks more pronounced, though they were hidden beneath the snow. He swallowed hard, feeling the knot in his stomach tighten. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to decide now. The safer route was a little further to the left, but it would take more time to reach. The other path, the one that looked riskier, might get him across faster, but there was no guarantee it would hold. Samuel hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He thought of his friends, of the warmth, the food, the safety that awaited him. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. His mind raced as he scanned the ice in front of him, trying to make a quick, calculated decision. His instincts were telling him to go left, to take the longer, safer route. He trusted his instincts. There was no room for recklessness. With a deep breath, Samuel turned slightly, veering left, making his way around the thin section of ice. He focused on every step, feeling the tension in his body mount with each careful move. The ice creaked underfoot, but he didn't dare rush. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he made it to the far side of the river. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his legs were sore from the effort. But he had made it. He was on solid ground once again. The snow-covered banks of Winterbrook Creek ahead of him, the cabin just beyond the trees. He paused for a moment, allowing himself a brief moment of relief. The river was behind him now, the hardest part of the journey complete. But there was still a long road ahead. Samuel knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not now, not with the night drawing closer and the dangers of the wilderness still looming. With one final glance at the frozen river, Samuel moved forward, pushing through the cold and the snow toward the cabin. He wasn't out of danger yet, but he was closer, and that was all that mattered now. Chapter 6: A Dangerous Mistake. The silence of the wilderness was almost deafening, broken only by the occasional howl of the wind that swept through the snow-covered trees. Samuel had made it past the frozen river, his heart still pounding from the intense concentration it had taken to cross. He stood on the far side of the river now, the forest around him stretching out in every direction, covered in an unbroken layer of snow. The daylight was quickly fading, the gray sky dimming as the sun sank lower on the horizon. The night would soon fall, and with it would come the bone-chilling cold that Samuel knew all too well. But for now, there was a brief sense of calm. The hardest part was behind him. The river had been crossed, and though his body was sore and weary, the promise of Winterbrook Creek was close. His friends, the warmth of their fire, and the food that awaited him seemed almost within reach now. Just a few more miles. Samuel's breath came in visible clouds, sharp and cold as he pressed forward, putting one foot in front of the other. He had learned to ignore the aches in his legs and the biting cold that gnawed at his face. He had come this far. It would all be worth it in the end. But as he walked, the harshness of the cold began to sink deeper into his skin. It was as if the wind had grown colder, the snow heavier. The landscape around him felt like an unyielding white desert, endless and unforgiving. With every step, Samuel could feel the weight of the wilderness pressing down on him, the silence of the world around him adding to the oppressive sense of isolation. As he continued along the path, his mind wandered, partly to the warmth of his destination, but also to the many warnings he had heard about this part of the wilderness. His thoughts drifted back to the locals he had spoken with before setting out. They had all said the same thing. Be careful of the snow-covered streams. The ice can be deceiving. Samuel had shrugged off their warnings. He had crossed streams before, had walked through blizzards, had made it through the toughest conditions. What were a few more miles in the cold? But now, with the landscape stretching on endlessly, and the snow piling up more heavily with each passing minute, Samuel began to feel the weight of their words. The snow-covered ground ahead of him looked solid, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, a feeling that told him to slow down, to be cautious. Samuel paused and looked ahead. The ground was uneven, the snow deeper in some places than in others. The trail had become more difficult to follow, the path lost beneath the thick layers of snow. He couldn't see where the trail ended and where the next hazard might lie. Every step was becoming harder, his progress slower as the snow continued to build up. His boots sunk deeper into the powder, making his legs ache with every movement. For a brief moment, he considered stopping to rest. The exhaustion was starting to take its toll, and the cold was beginning to feel unbearable. But then he shook his head. No, he couldn't stop now. Winterbrook Creek wasn't far. His friends were waiting. He couldn't afford to lose time now, not when he was so close. With that thought in mind, Samuel pushed forward once again. He was careful to avoid the deeper drifts, trying to keep to the more solid-looking snowbanks. His eyes were fixed on the path ahead, the only goal in his mind being to reach his destination. But in his focus, he missed something small, something critical. Ahead, the ground seemed to flatten, the snow less deep. Samuel, eager to continue his journey, moved forward quickly, not stopping to think. He stepped onto what he believed to be solid ground, his weight shifting as he put more pressure on his foot. Suddenly, the ice beneath him shifted. He heard it first, a soft cracking sound, barely audible over the wind. Then, a sudden, sharp crack. Before Samuel could react, his foot slipped, the snow giving way beneath him. He felt his heart race as the ground beneath him shifted again, and with a terrifying suddenness, he realized the ice was thin, too thin, to hold his weight. Samuel tried to pull his foot back, but it was too late. His other foot, caught off guard by the sudden shift, slid as well, sending him crashing down onto the icy surface below. The cold hit him like a slap in the face, and the freezing water beneath the thin layer of ice surged up to meet him. His body sank into the snow, and for a moment, everything seemed to slow. He could feel the cold creeping up his legs, soaking through his clothes, wrapping around him like a vice. Panic surged in his chest. He had been so sure, so confident. How could he have missed this? The ice had looked solid, but it had betrayed him. The underground currents beneath the ice had weakened the surface, and now he was in danger. The water, though not deep, was freezing, and in this cold, the slightest misstep could prove fatal. His boots, now wet and cold, felt like lead weights, dragging him deeper into the freezing landscape. Instinctively, Samuel pulled himself back, struggling to regain his balance. His heart was pounding, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as he forced himself to move. But the cold was already taking its toll. His legs felt numb, his feet freezing. The wetness from the ice soaked through his clothes and chilled him to the core. His thoughts raced. He couldn't afford to stay like this. If he didn't act quickly, he could lose feeling in his limbs, his body could go numb, and then he might not be able to get up at all. He had to build a fire. He had to dry his clothes. If he didn't, if he stayed like this in the cold, it might be the end. With great effort, Samuel pulled himself upright, his body shaking from the cold. The wind howled louder now, swirling snow in every direction. His vision blurred from the freezing fog in his breath, and he staggered a few steps back, away from the thin ice. His knees felt weak, his body exhausted, but he kept moving. He couldn't stop. Not now. The danger of his mistake was clear now. He had underestimated the treacherous nature of the ice, had rushed forward without properly assessing the situation. Now, he was paying the price. He was lucky the cold hadn't claimed him completely, but he knew deep down that this mistake could have cost him everything. With his heart still pounding and his legs unsteady, Samuel moved carefully away from the broken ice, forcing himself to remain calm. His goal was still the same. Winterbrook Creek. But now, the journey had become a race against the cold. He had to find shelter, warmth, and safety. Time was running out. Chapter 7. A Setback. The cold was more intense now. The sky had darkened and the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a wild beast. Samuel could feel the storm growing stronger, the icy wind biting at his face, forcing him to squint against the sharp gusts. The snow had begun to fall harder, thick flakes swirling in the air, obscuring his view and making the world feel even more isolated. His clothes were soaked through from the icy water of the river, his boots heavy with the weight of the wet snow. Every step felt like a burden. His legs ached, his feet were numb, and his body felt like it was shutting down, slow and methodical, one part at a time. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't afford to. Not now. Samuel's mind raced as he moved through the snow-covered forest. His breath came out in sharp, visible puffs, mixing with the swirling snow. Each exhale a reminder of how much time had passed and how much colder it was getting. He had been so close to reaching Winterbrook Creek, but now it felt like the world was closing in on him. Every direction he looked seemed the same. Endless trees, endless snow. The path was becoming more difficult to follow, and every new obstacle, every new challenge, only seemed to make the goal further away. And then, the setback came. Samuel had been walking for what felt like hours, though it could have been less. His thoughts a blur of exhaustion and determination. The wind had grown more ferocious, driving the snow in all directions, and Samuel had to shield his eyes to avoid the sting. But through the haze of swirling snow, he saw something that made his heart sink. A small cluster of trees, bare, skeletal limbs coated in ice and snow, stood in front of him. The familiar stretch of white ground had been replaced with a thick, uneven blanket of snow. Samuel's eyes narrowed as he trudged toward the cluster of trees, but the closer he got, the more he realized the problem. The trees were covered in thick, heavy snow. The snow was so deep it almost looked like a thick blanket, almost as though the snow itself was waiting to collapse under the weight. And in between the trees, he noticed something else. Small piles of dry twigs and grass. A sign of something that had been left behind earlier in the year, perhaps by floodwaters or the shifting of the earth. These were things he could use, things he would need to build a fire. The idea of warmth, of a fire to warm his cold body, made his heart race. But there was something else, too. Something unsettling. As Samuel took a step closer to the trees, he felt a sudden shift beneath his feet. The snow was thick but not solid. It felt spongy, almost too soft, as though it would give way if he wasn't careful. The snow creaked underfoot, and a quick glance downward revealed the growing risk. He was standing on a patch of snow that was too unstable. The weight of his body was shifting the snow around him, and with the layers of frost and ice built up. Over the season, Samuel knew it wouldn't take much for everything to collapse. If the snow underfoot gave way, he could find himself sinking, buried in the snow, trapped beneath the weight of it. Samuel stopped in his tracks, heart pounding. Panic crept into his chest, but he forced it back. He had to remain calm. The storm was getting worse. His situation was growing more dangerous by the second. He couldn't afford to get stuck here, unable to move. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no time to waste. The snow was already deep enough, but now, with the added danger of the soft, unstable ground beneath him, it was a trap. His path forward was blocked, and if he didn't find a way around it, it would only get worse. The heavy snow continued to fall. Samuel's mind raced as he surveyed his options. The path through the trees wasn't an option anymore, not without risking more injury or worse. His eyes scanned the horizon, searching for another way, but the snowstorm had made everything indistinguishable. The trees, the snow, the endless white landscape. It all blended together in one giant blur of isolation and cold. He had to backtrack. The decision burned him with frustration, but he knew it was the only way. Samuel turned around, the heavy weight of the decision pressing down on him. He moved slowly, deliberately, trying not to disturb the snow any more than necessary. Every movement was calculated, every step heavier than the last, as he made his way back through the forest. The deep snow made it difficult to navigate, and, with each step, the wind bit harder at his exposed skin. It felt like the wilderness itself was conspiring against him. The familiar path seemed farther away than ever now. He couldn't stop to rest, not with the wind howling, not with the night quickly closing in. The cold had already sunk into his bones, but now it seemed to creep deeper, wrapping around him with every step, dragging him down with the weight of exhaustion. The setback had cost him time, and now he was losing more. Samuel pushed through the frustration, focusing only on the next step, on the next piece of ground to cover. But even with all his determination, he knew that the risk was growing. His goal, his destination, seemed farther away than ever before. The idea of failure kept creeping into his mind. Had he misjudged this whole journey? Had he been too overconfident? Too quick to dismiss the dangers, the warnings? Was he really capable of making it through this? The wilderness was relentless, unforgiving. And though he had come so far, this setback felt like a reminder that he wasn't in control. Nature, it seemed, was the true master here. He stumbled forward, his legs heavy and aching, but the thought of Winterbrook Creek kept him moving. He would find a way to push through this. He couldn't afford to stop now. The fire, the warmth, the safety, he couldn't let it slip away. Not after everything he had already endured. The wind continued to howl around him, and the snow kept falling. But Samuel wouldn't stop. Not yet. Chapter 8. A Life-Saving Fire. The storm raged on, the wind howling through the trees and the snow falling harder with each passing minute. Samuel's body had already begun to betray him. His legs were trembling with exhaustion, his hands stiff and unresponsive from the bitter cold. His boots, once sturdy and reliable, were now heavy with the weight of the wet snow, and every step felt like dragging weights through thick mud. The cold had seeped deep into his bones, and he could feel it in his chest, his limbs, and even in his very thoughts. He had made it this far, but for how much longer could he continue? The snowstorm was relentless, the wind cutting through him like shards of ice. He knew he had to find shelter. He needed warmth, food, and rest. The thought of his friends waiting for him at Winterbrook Creek still burned in his mind, but it felt like a distant dream, one that was slipping farther and farther away with every passing minute. Samuel had managed to backtrack, but now he stood in the middle of the forest, the snow swirling around him. He could hardly see through the heavy flakes that blocked his vision, and every step he took seemed to only get him deeper into the wilderness, farther from his goal. The forest was silent, save for the howl of the wind and the trees around. Him seemed to close in, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He had been walking for what felt like hours, but time had become irrelevant. It was the cold that mattered now. His body was numb from the freezing temperatures, his face frozen from the constant battering of snow and wind. He had no idea how much longer he could keep moving before he simply gave in to the elements. But then, in the midst of the storm, a thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. He needed a fire. A fire was the only way to survive the brutal cold that was quickly draining him of his strength. He needed warmth. He needed to dry his clothes, and he needed to regain some semblance of control over his situation. Without it, the cold would be his undoing. His mind raced as he scanned the landscape around him. He had to find dry wood. He had to find something to start the fire. The snow was everywhere, thick and deep. But Samuel knew that with careful searching, he might still find something. Dried twigs, branches, or grass left behind from the year's floods. The old trees around him were covered with thick white snow, but underneath the branches there might still be something that could burn. It was his only hope. Samuel moved slowly through the snow, each step feeling heavier than the last, each breath a struggle as he pushed through the storm. He was exhausted, every part of him fighting against the cold. His fingers were numb, barely able to grip his knife as he hacked away at some of the small branches that had been weighed down by snow. They were covered in ice, but with enough effort, he managed to break them off, careful not to damage the wood beneath. He needed this wood to start a fire. He found a small patch of dry grass hidden under the snow near the base of one of the trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough. With his knife, he scraped the surface of the snow to uncover it, his hands shaking from both cold and frustration. This was the moment that would determine whether he survived or not. His mind raced, adrenaline, mixing with panic as he worked to gather what he could. The wind howled again, and Samuel felt the sting of the cold in his lungs, but he pushed it away. He needed to focus. He needed to stay sharp. If he failed now, there was no coming back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he had a small pile of wood, dry twigs, branches and dried grass, arranged carefully on the snow. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Now came the hardest part, getting the fire started. His hands were stiff and numb, making it nearly impossible to strike his matches. Samuel fumbled through his pocket, his fingers numb and uncooperative. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing in on him, the cold already seeping deeper into his body, threatening to steal away his strength. He had a limited number of matches left, and if they failed, he might not have the energy to try again. He had no choice. His hands shook as he pulled out a match, the small stick feeling like it weighed a ton. His breath came out in jagged bursts, the freezing air cutting through his clothes. With trembling hands, he struck the match, the tiny flame flickering for just a moment before it went out. Samuel cursed under his breath, frustration threatening to overwhelm him. He knew he had to try again. There was no time for hesitation. He reached into his pocket for another match, his fingers desperately searching, trying to pull out the match without fumbling it. This time, the match caught, and the tiny flame began to flicker in the wind. Samuel quickly bent down, shielding the fire from the storm with his hands, and carefully brought it closer to the dry twigs and grass he had gathered. The flame sputtered for a moment, almost extinguishing in the harsh wind. But then it took hold, growing stronger with each passing second. He held his breath as the fire slowly began to catch, the dry grass crackling as the flames spread to the twigs. The warmth was immediate, the heat from the small fire rushing up to meet his frozen body. Samuel felt a wave of relief wash over him as the fire grew stronger, its light flickering in the dark, stormy night. It was small, fragile, but it was enough. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Samuel felt warmth on his face, in his chest, in his hands. The fire crackled and popped, its warmth a lifeline in the freezing wilderness. Samuel knelt down beside it, his body aching with relief as he held his numb hands near the flames. The heat spread through him, thawing, the stiffness in his limbs and bringing some semblance of life back to his frozen skin. His breath slowed, and for the first time since the storm had begun, he could feel his body relaxing, his muscles unwinding as the warmth spread through him. Samuel watched the fire with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The small flame was a beacon of hope, a symbol of survival in the face of the overwhelming cold. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was enough to keep him alive. As the fire continued to grow stronger, Samuel knew that his journey wasn't over yet. There was still so much more to do, still so many miles to go. But for now, in this moment, he allowed himself to feel safe. The fire was keeping him warm, the promise of his friends and Winterbrook Creek still alive in his mind. The storm howled around him, the snow continuing to fall, but for the first time in hours, Samuel didn't feel alone. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was fighting back. The fire was his ally, his protection against the cold, his chance to push forward. And so, with the warmth of the fire at his back and his body slowly regaining its strength, Samuel took a deep breath and made a silent vow to continue. He would make it. He would survive. The fire was just the beginning. Chapter 9. A Cold Mistake. The fire crackled softly as Samuel sat with his back pressed against a tree, his body still shaking from the cold. The warmth from the flames seeped into his limbs, gradually thawing the numbness that had taken over. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to relax, the tension in his shoulders loosening just slightly. The storm outside continued to rage on, the wind howling through the trees like a wild animal. But within the small circle of warmth created by the fire, Samuel found comfort. He could breathe more easily now, his thoughts no longer clouded by panic or fear. For a moment, he could almost believe that everything would be okay. He sat there, lost in the rhythmic sound of the fire's crackling, his eyes glazed from exhaustion. The swirling snow outside seemed distant, almost irrelevant. The fire was his lifeline, and with each passing second, he felt his strength return. But it was at that moment, in the midst of the fragile calm, that the reality of his situation hit him again. His mind, though momentarily soothed by the warmth, began to stir. He had no choice but to keep moving, to press forward. Winterbrook Creek was still miles away, and he couldn't afford to rest too long. The cold, the storm, it was all still out there, waiting for him. His friends were waiting for him, but the wilderness was unforgiving, and time was slipping away. The fire was the first victory he'd had in hours, but it wouldn't be enough to ensure his survival. As the fire burned on, Samuel realized that he had been so focused on finding warmth that he had let his guard down. He hadn't fully appreciated just how dangerous the snow and ice were. He had been careless. For a fleeting moment, his confidence had returned, a false sense of security that made him believe he could handle the cold, that he could handle everything. But the mistake he had made was clear now, and it would cost him. Samuel's mind flashed back to the earlier part of his journey when he had crossed the frozen river. He had been so focused on getting across, on reaching Winterbrook Creek, that he hadn't taken the time to truly assess the situation. The ice had looked solid, but beneath the surface there had been weakness, cracks that had been hidden under the snow, waiting for the right moment to betray him. He had been in such a rush, so eager to get to the other side, that he hadn't stopped to consider the risks. The ice had given way under his feet, and he had plunged into the freezing water, narrowly avoiding disaster. That moment had been a wake-up call. But now, with the fire warming his body and the snow swirling around him, Samuel felt the weight of his mistake press down on him again. The fire, though life-saving, had created a false sense of security. The danger was still out there, still waiting for him to make another mistake. He had become too comfortable, too confident. The wilderness didn't care about how much he had already suffered or how close he was to his destination. It would keep testing him, pushing him further into the unknown until he made another mistake, and this time he might not be so lucky. Samuel's mind raced, and he stood up abruptly, pushing himself away from the fire. His muscles screamed in protest, but he forced himself to ignore the pain. He had to focus. The warmth from the fire had dulled his senses, and now, as the wind howled louder and the snow swirled more intensely, he realized how foolish it had been to grow too comfortable. He moved quickly, gathering the remnants of the firewood he had collected earlier and adding it to the flames. The fire sputtered, growing stronger again as he worked. It was too easy to become complacent out here, to convince himself that everything was fine just because he had a fire. But the truth was, he was still alone, still vulnerable to the relentless cold. He needed to stay sharp, to stay vigilant. The fire wasn't enough to protect him from everything. It was just a temporary relief. He had to keep moving, keep pressing forward. If he didn't, the wilderness would swallow him whole. With the fire now blazing brightly once more, Samuel stepped back, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The storm was still fierce, and he knew he couldn't afford to wait too long. The cold would return, and if he didn't make it to Winterbrook Creek soon, the warmth of the fire would be the last comfort he'd ever know. He had to take action, but even as he prepared to leave, a nagging feeling lingered in his mind. As he gathered his things, Samuel's thoughts turned to the ice again. The ice that had almost claimed him earlier. The snow and ice had been deceiving, and he had been too quick to trust them. The mistake had been clear. He had assumed the worst was over, that he had overcome the dangers of the wilderness. But the wilderness had a way of reminding you of your place, of showing you just how fragile your survival was. One misstep, one moment of overconfidence, and it could all be taken away. Samuel took a deep breath. his chest rising with the cold air, and he stood still for a moment. He had to admit it. He was scared. For the first time since he had started this journey, he was truly frightened. The dangers weren't just physical anymore. The cold had seeped into his mind, into his thoughts, and it was beginning to chip away at his resolve. It was easy to forget, in the warmth of the fire, that the wilderness had no mercy. There was no room for mistakes here. He looked down at his hands, stiff and numb from the cold, and he realized just how close he had come to losing control. The warmth of the fire had lulled him into a false sense of safety. But out here, in the wilderness, there was no such thing as safety. There was only survival. With one final glance at the fire, Samuel turned his back on it, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he had made a mistake, but there was no time to dwell on it. He had to keep moving, to stay ahead of the dangers that surrounded him. The fire had saved him once, but it was no guarantee of survival. He had to be smarter. He had to be better. The wind howled again, louder this time, and Samuel knew that the storm was only just beginning. But he wasn't going to let it stop him. He wasn't going to let it break him. He would keep moving forward, step by careful step, until he reached Winterbrook Creek. He had learned his lesson the hard way. But he wasn't going to let that lesson be his undoing. He set out into the snow once more, the cold biting at his skin, but his resolve stronger than ever. The mistake had been made, but it wouldn't define him. Not this time. Chapter 10. The Final Decision. The wind screamed through the trees, carrying with it the unmistakable bite of the Arctic cold. The snow was coming down in relentless sheets, a swirling white mist that seemed to blot out the world around Samuel. Every step he took felt like a battle. His feet, once stiff from the freezing waters of the river, were now numb from the constant exposure to the icy terrain. His clothes, though layered, couldn't shield him from the gnawing cold that threatened to consume him whole. The storm had intensified, the snowflakes now sharp, like tiny daggers slicing through the air. Samuel's breath was ragged, his lungs burning with each inhale as the frigid air cut through his chest. He had been walking for what felt like an eternity, the terrain blurring around him, each step seemingly as hard as the last. His legs ached from exhaustion, his body drained of energy. The fire, the only warmth he had managed to create, felt like a distant memory now, swallowed by the storm that had returned with a vengeance. As he trudged on, His thoughts were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He had come so far, survived so many obstacles, and yet now he was beginning to question everything. His resolve, once firm and unshakable, was starting to fray. The reality of his situation began to settle in. He was alone, far from any help, with only the wilderness around him, indifferent to his suffering. His mind kept telling him that Winterbrook Creek was just up ahead, that his friends were waiting for him. But the storm made it impossible to tell just how far he had come and how much farther he had to go. Samuel paused for a moment, his body sagging with the weight of his fatigue. He wiped the snow from his face, but it was hopeless. More snow quickly replaced it, piling up against him as though the world itself wanted to bury him. He could feel the exhaustion creeping into his bones, threatening to take over. His muscles, which had carried him this far, felt like they were giving out. His mind, once sharp and focused, was now foggy, clouded by hunger, cold, and fatigue. He was running on empty. There was a voice inside his head, a voice that was growing louder with each passing minute. It told him to stop, to find shelter, to rest and wait for the storm to pass. It told him that Winterbrook Creek, his goal, might not be worth the risk anymore. It whispered that he was too weak, that he couldn't make it, and that the wilderness had already decided his fate. But there was another voice, one that was softer, yet persistent. The voice of defiance. It told him to keep going, to push through the pain and the cold, to survive. It told him that he had made it this far, and he wasn't about to give up now. Samuel took a deep breath, pulling his jacket tighter around him. The cold bit at his face, but he ignored it. The wind howled louder, but he shut it out. For a moment, he closed his eyes, his body trembling from both exhaustion and the freezing temperatures. Was it worth it? The thought crossed his mind again, stronger than before. His friends, the warmth, the safety. How far away did that dream feel now? He was alone in this vast wilderness, surrounded by nothing but snow, ice, and the endless stretch of trees. The journey to Winterbrook Creek had been long and fraught with danger, but now it seemed like a distant goal that was growing increasingly impossible to reach. Samuel thought back to the warnings of the old men in Fairbanks. They had said that no man should travel alone in such extreme cold. The risks were too great. Yet, here he was, alone and far from help, in the middle of a storm that showed no signs of letting up. His fingers were stiff from the cold, his limbs were heavy, and his heart felt like it was slowing down. The warmth he had felt from the fire earlier had long since faded, replaced by the cold of the storm and the isolation. He had made mistakes. He knew that now. The river crossing, the overconfidence, the moments when he had let his guard down. All of them had led him to this point, standing alone in the storm, questioning whether he could continue or not. But the one thing that he hadn't done was quit. Not yet. Samuel took a long, steadying breath, pushing away the dark thoughts that tried to take root. There was no room for doubt now. He couldn't let it consume him. He had survived this long, hadn't he? He had come through the worst of it, and the one thing he still had was his determination. That, and the will to live. The thought of Winterbrook Creek came to him again, this time clearer than before. His friends, their warmth, the fire, they were waiting for him. They were out there, just ahead. And though the storm made it impossible to see them, he knew that if he stopped now, if he gave in to the cold and the exhaustion, he would never reach them. He couldn't let that happen. Samuel stood straighter, his legs feeling like lead, but he willed them to move. His eyes squinted through the snow as he looked ahead. He couldn't see anything clearly. The storm had taken that away, but he could feel it in his chest. He could feel that Winterbrook Creek was just within reach, that it was closer than it had ever been before. He had come too far to stop now. He had made it this far, hadn't he? This wasn't the time to give up. Not when everything he had fought for was so close. The warmth, the safety, the comfort, he could almost feel it. So, with a final, steadying breath, Samuel made his decision. The voice of doubt, the voice that had been whispering in his head, was silenced. The storm raged around him, but he stepped forward, each step more determined than the last. His feet felt heavy, and his body was screaming at him to stop, but he pressed on. He wasn't going to let the wilderness win. Not today. The storm was fierce, the cold unrelenting, but Samuel had made his decision. He would not turn back. He would survive. The next step was a small victory, but each one brought him closer to Winterbrook Creek, closer to his friends, closer to the warmth that awaited him. And so Samuel kept moving forward, each step a testament to his will to live, to survive, to reach his goal. The wilderness had tested him, but he was still here, still fighting. He would make it. He would not be defeated. The storm continued to rage, but Samuel's resolve was stronger than ever. He was not alone. He had the strength to keep going, and he would reach Winterbrook Creek. Great work today! Every moment you spend practicing brings you closer to mastering your English listening and speaking skills. Remember, progress comes with patience and consistency. If this story inspired you or helped you in your learning journey, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Easy English Spark channel for more lessons and stories. Keep listening, keep speaking, and keep believing in your growth. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and keep shining.